On June 25, 1942, deep inside the heart of Nazi Germany, a senior colonel of the Wehrmacht sat in stunned silence, his pen frozen above the page. Reports from across the Atlantic had reached Berlin. Documents filled not with speculation, but with hard numbers. Production figures, factory outputs, shipments rolling off assembly lines in Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh, and beyond. What he read was more terrifying than any weapon the Americans could field, more devastating than any fleet they could launch. It was the sheer unstoppable scale of American industry. For the colonel, a career officer raised on the iron discipline and technical brilliance of the German war machine, this realization hit like a thunderclap. He knew in that moment that Germany had no chance. Only a year earlier, the Third Reich had seemed unstoppable. Blitzkrieg had torn through Poland, France, and the Low Countries with lightning speed. The Wehrmacht marched into the Balkans. The Luftwaffe pounded London, and now German armies pressed deep into Soviet territory. And yet, here in these factory reports, the colonel saw the outlines of doom. America had entered the war only 7 months earlier, after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Its military was small, untested, still mobilizing. But its factories, they were waking giants, and once awake, there would be no stopping them. He stared at the figures. Tens of thousands of aircraft ordered, tens of thousands of tanks, millions of rifles. He understood what many in Hitler's inner circle refused to admit. This war could not be won against a nation capable of turning its assembly lines into arsenals of democracy. The German colonel's revelation was not born in a vacuum. To understand its weight, we must return to the roots of industrial war and the philosophy that shaped both nations. Germany had always prided itself on precision engineering, craftsmanship, and technical superiority. Its tanks, like the Panzer IV and later the Panther, were marvels of design, machines that struck fear into Allied crews. Its aircraft, sleek and deadly, were the products of a culture that valued mastery of detail. Yet as the colonel now realized, war in the 20th century was no longer about perfection. It was about volume. It was about scale. It was about building not the best machine, but the most machines. And in that contest, America reigned supreme. This realization was not something easily spoken aloud in Berlin in 1942. To voice doubt in the Reich's eventual victory was to risk one's career, even one's life. Yet the colonel was not the first German officer to glimpse the terrifying implications of America's entry into the war. Even as early as 1941, some within the General Staff had warned that if the United States were allowed to mobilize its economy, the outcome was preordained. They remembered the First World War, when American production and manpower had tipped the balance against Germany in 1917 and 1918, and this time America's industrial might was even greater. The colonel, educated, methodical, and loyal, could not dismiss the numbers staring back at him. Tens of thousands of aircraft ordered, Liberty ships sliding down their launchways by the hundreds. Tanks, rifles, trucks, endless trucks, flooding out of factories that ran day and night. The colonel had seen the Reich's factories himself. He knew the pride that came with walking through the assembly halls of Daimler-Benz or Krupp, watching German workers craft parts with microscopic precision. But he also knew the flaws. German industry was not designed for mass war. It was fragmented, competitive, hamstrung by politics and by Hitler's obsession with prestige projects. Where America built standardized models, Germany indulged in constant redesigns. Where America valued speed, Germany valued complexity. The result was that German tanks, aircraft, and weapons were often superior in design, but too few in number to alter the tide of war. when President Franklin Roosevelt, in December 1940, declared that the United States must become the arsenal of democracy. It had sounded like a slogan, but it was no slogan, it was prophecy. The great industrialists of America, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, Boeing, Kaiser, answered the call. The automobile assembly lines of Detroit did not merely adapt. They transformed. Conveyor belts that once carried shiny sedans now rolled tanks, jeeps, and artillery pieces into the daylight. Factories that once echoed with the rhythm of civilian industry now thundered with the roar of war production. Willow Run, Henry Ford's massive bomber plant in Michigan, stretched for more than a mile, the largest factory under a single roof on Earth. At its peak, it produced one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes, a scale so staggering that even the most hardened German officers struggled to comprehend it. The colonel, leafing through the reports, could see that America's war machine was unlike any other. It was not merely the factories themselves, but the spirit of mobilization behind them. Entire cities were reoriented toward war. Young men left for the front, and their sisters, wives, and mothers filled the void. For the first time, women entered the industrial workforce en masse, tens of thousands of Rosie the Riveters wielding welding torches, rivet guns, and lathes. They were not engineers by training, not craftsmen by tradition, yet they learned quickly, and they produced tirelessly. Their output became a weapon just as potent as the rifles on the battlefield. Germany, meanwhile, struggled under the weight of its own contradictions. Nazi ideology despised the idea of women in factories, preferring to relegate them to the home. It rejected efficiency when efficiency clashed with dogma. Its leaders ordered resources diverted into vanity projects like the colossal Tiger tank, an engineering masterpiece, but so complex and resource-hungry that it crippled production. The colonel had seen these machines. He admired their power, their craftsmanship. But admiration turned hollow when he compared their output to America's. For every Tiger that rolled onto the battlefield, the United States could field dozens of Shermans, backed by fleets of supply trucks, supported by aircraft built in quantities Germany could not dream of matching. This was the essence of modern war, and the colonel saw it with painful clarity. Battles were won not merely by courage or even by strategy, but by the relentless math of production. 1,000 tanks against 100, 10,000 planes against 1,000. Supply lines stretching unbroken, powered by millions of engines, wheels, and ships. The American system thrived not on perfect machines, but on good enough machines, produced so quickly in such numbers that they overwhelmed all opposition. A Sherman tank was no panther in single combat, but war was not fought in duels. War was fought by armies, and armies moved on numbers. Reports of America's shipbuilding reached him as well. Liberty ships, unglamorous, functional, mass-produced cargo carriers, were being launched at a rate so astonishing it bordered on the surreal. The colonel had read of one shipyard that completed a Liberty ship in just over 4 days, a feat achieved by Henry Kaiser's revolutionary assembly line approach to shipbuilding. Germany, with its limited dockyards and artisanal methods, could never replicate such speed. It could only watch as America built a navy capable of stretching across oceans, supplying men and material to every corner of the globe, and beyond ships and tanks and planes. There was the human factor, the inexhaustible reservoir of manpower and labor. America was not under siege. Its cities were not bombed. Its factories were not flattened by enemy raids. It could build and build and build without interruption. The colonel knew what that meant. For every German factory laboring under the threat of Allied bombers, there were 10 American factories working in safety, their productivity accelerating year by year. He thought, too, of the future. Even if Germany triumphed temporarily in Russia, even if it held the line in North Africa, what then? Could the Reich sustain a war against an opponent who produced machines like a river flowing without end? Could German soldiers continue to fight when outnumbered, outsupplied, and outproduced on every front? His heart told him the answer was no. His mind confirmed it. The figures did not lie. The colonel had been taught to believe in German destiny, in the inevitability of victory under the Führer's leadership. But in that quiet office, staring at American production numbers, he felt a weight he could not dismiss. The Reich, for all its ferocity, was mortal. America's factories were not. They were steel giants, breathing fire and smoke, turning raw ore into weapons at a pace that defied imagination. Against such giants, the Reich's days were numbered. He set his pen down, hands trembling slightly, and allowed himself a thought that few in Berlin dared to voice. Germany could not win this war, not against America, not against its factories, its workers, its inexhaustible will to produce. He closed the file, knowing that history had already turned against them, even if the battlefield had yet to reveal it. By 1943, the colonel's unease had transformed into dread, for what he had once glimpsed in numbers was now visible in blood and iron across the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific. The documents he had studied in 1942 had foretold a storm, but now the storm was upon them, and it was unrelenting. The Wehrmacht, once feared as the most efficient military force in history, found itself staggering under a weight it could not throw off. German soldiers still fought with skill and bravery. German engineers still produced machines of breathtaking power, but the tide was turning, and the colonel knew why. He saw it in every intercepted report, in every battlefield communique, in every desperate request from the front lines. America's factories were now fully awake. The scale of that awakening was unprecedented. In 1943 alone, the United States produced over 85,000 tanks and armored vehicles, more than the total number of tanks Germany would manufacture in the entire war. The skies above Europe darkened not with storm clouds, but with fleets of American bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, accompanied by swarms of long-range P-51 Mustangs that now escorted them all the way to Berlin and back. The colonel had once believed in the invincibility of the Luftwaffe, in the ability of German fighter aces to dominate the skies. But he could not ignore the reality. For every German aircraft shot down, America built 5 more. For every skilled pilot lost, America trained dozens. On the ground, the same imbalance revealed itself. Reports from the Eastern Front told of German divisions running low on fuel, ammunition, and replacement vehicles. In North Africa, the Afrika Korps had fought brilliantly under Rommel, but by 1943 it was crumbling, strangled by lack of supplies. Meanwhile, American convoys carried endless streams of trucks, jeeps, food and fuel across the Atlantic, unbroken despite the U-boat threat. The colonel understood that it was not merely tanks and planes that defined victory. It was logistics, the invisible arteries of war. And in logistics, America was unmatched. The Dodge truck, mass-produced by the hundreds of thousands, became the backbone of Allied mobility. German soldiers, trudging through mud, watched in despair as their enemies sped past in endless convoys of motorized transport, vehicles that seemed to multiply as if conjured from nothing. In conference rooms in Berlin, Hitler and his inner circle continued to indulge in fantasies. They spoke of miracle weapons, The V-2 rockets, the jet fighters, the monstrous Tiger II tanks that would reverse Germany's fortunes. But the colonel had stopped believing in miracles. He knew that these weapons, however advanced, could never be built in numbers sufficient to change the course of the war. Each Tiger II required weeks of labor and vast resources. Each jet engine strained factories already short of materials. America, meanwhile, produced weapons by the tens of thousands. It did not matter if a Sherman tank was weaker than a Panther in single combat. What mattered was that the Americans could field 10 Shermans for every Panther and keep them supplied with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. The colonel thought often of Willow Run, of those reports that had once seemed abstract. Now he saw the fruit of that industrial colossus, endless streams of bombers filling the skies, dropping their loads on German cities, crippling factories, shattering morale. He saw the reality of Henry Kaiser's shipyards, where Liberty ships slid into the water faster than U-boats could sink them. He read with horror of the Normandy landings, where an armada of thousands of ships, an armada only America could have assembled, crossed the channel and disgorged men and machines onto the beaches of France. In that moment, the colonel realized that the war was no longer being fought on equal terms. It was no longer a duel between Germany and its enemies. It was a war of attrition, and in a war of attrition against America, there could be only one outcome. As 1943 turned into 1944, the imbalance grew so vast that even the most loyal German officers could no longer ignore it. The skies above the Reich were filled with contrails stretching from horizon to horizon, formations of bombers so dense that anti-aircraft fire seemed like drops of rain against an ocean. Factories that once supplied the Wehrmacht were reduced to rubble. Oil refineries burned, choking the air with black smoke. Railways were shattered, cutting supply lines to the front. And still the Americans built more. Every day, new bombers rolled off the assembly lines. Every day, new ships carried supplies across the Atlantic. Every day, new soldiers trained, armed, and equipped for battle. The colonel's despair was sharpened by the knowledge that Germany's own factories could not keep pace. Allied bombing raids tore holes in the industrial heart of the Reich. Skilled workers were conscripted into the army, replaced by forced laborers who lacked training and motivation. Raw materials dwindled, stretched thin across too many projects. Hitler demanded new designs, more complex and ambitious than ever, ignoring the simple truth that complexity was a death sentence in a war that demanded speed. The colonel watched as Germany's arsenal grew ever smaller, even as America's grew ever larger. He thought often of the soldiers at the front, the boys who carried rifles into the frozen wastes of Russia, the men who crouched in bunkers along the Atlantic Wall, the crews who fought desperately in the skies. They were brave, loyal and disciplined, but bravery could not refill fuel tanks, loyalty could not replace lost tanks, and discipline could not conjure airplanes from empty hangars. America's factories, humming day and night, were feeding their enemies with an endless stream of weapons, and there was nothing Germany could do to stop it. By the summer of 1944, when the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy, the colonel no longer doubted the outcome. He read the reports of the invasion with a grim sense of inevitability. The sheer scale of the operation, over 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 156,000 men on the first day alone, was proof of everything he had feared. Only America, with its boundless industrial might, could have made such an invasion possible. And once that beachhead was secured, once the Allies established their foothold in France, the Reich's fate was sealed. In Berlin, propaganda still thundered of victory, of new weapons, of unbroken will. But the colonel did not believe it. He could not believe it. He had seen the truth too clearly, first in the numbers on the page, and now in the thunder of American war machines rolling across Europe. Germany had fought with brilliance, with courage, with ferocity. But against America's factories, none of it was enough. The war had become a contest of giants, and Germany was but a mortal struggling beneath their feet. As he walked the streets of Berlin, scarred by bombs, he thought of the workers in Detroit and Pittsburgh, in Seattle and Los Angeles, who labored not under fear of destruction, but with the confidence of distance and abundance. He thought of the women who riveted planes, the men who built ships, the engineers who perfected assembly lines. He thought of the Liberty ships, the endless Shermans, the skies filled with bombers, and he knew, with the certainty of one who has stared too long at the truth, that Germany had already lost. It was only a matter of time before the factories of America ground the Reich into dust. By the winter of 1944, the colonel no longer needed reports to know the truth. He could see it in the skies, hear it in the thunder of artillery, and feel it in the tremors that shook the ground of the Reich itself. What he had once glimpsed in production figures, what he had then witnessed on distant battlefields, was now at Germany's very doorstep. American power, born in factories thousands of miles away, was pressing relentlessly against the heart of Europe. For the colonel, there was no longer a question of if Germany would lose, but only when and how. And as he looked around at his nation, scarred by fire and exhaustion, he wondered not only about defeat, but about what kind of world would rise from the ruins. The year 1944 had opened with the Reich still clinging to illusions. Hitler believed that his armies could stabilize the Eastern Front, that miracle weapons would emerge in time, that the Atlantic Wall would hold against any invasion. But the colonel had already abandoned such fantasies. The war had become a test of endurance, and America's endurance was limitless. The Battle of the Atlantic, once Germany's lifeline, was already lost. Liberty ships and escort carriers swarmed the seas, overwhelming the dwindling U-boat fleet. The skies above Germany were no longer German skies. Every day, wave after wave of American bombers reduced cities to rubble. Hamburg, Cologne, Frankfurt, and Berlin itself, each became an inferno under the weight of high explosives and fire bombs. The colonel walked through the ruins of his capital and knew that industry could not survive this onslaught. Even if a factory rose again, even if machines were rebuilt, another raid would come, and another, until nothing remained. And still, the Americans built. Even as Germany struggled to produce a few hundred aircraft, America produced thousands each month. By 1944, the United States was manufacturing nearly 100,000 aircraft per year. Factories in Seattle and California rolled out B-29 superfortresses, machines so advanced they seemed like science fiction to German eyes. The colonel read reports of their range, their bomb load, their power, and felt the weight of inevitability crush him further. If America could unleash such machines against Japan, how long before Germany too felt their wrath? He had already seen what the B-17 and B-24 could do. Now the horizon promised even worse. On the ground, the disparity was equally stark. When Germany launched its final desperate offensive in December 1944, the Ardennes counterattack, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, the colonel prayed for a miracle. For a moment, German troops surged forward, breaking through Allied lines, encircling towns, forcing Americans to retreat. For a moment it seemed as though the old brilliance of blitzkrieg had returned, but it was a fleeting illusion. the offensive, halted not because German soldiers lacked courage, but because they lacked fuel, trucks, and replacements. Tanks ran out of gasoline, freezing in the forests of Belgium like stranded beasts. Supplies dwindled, leaving divisions stranded. Meanwhile, America's factories had already prepared for such a counterstroke. Within weeks, fresh divisions, armed with fresh tanks and supplied by endless convoys, rolled forward. The bulge in the lines was hammered flat, and with it the last hope of Germany's high command. The colonel, reading the aftermath reports, felt only numbness. The Battle of the Bulge had consumed precious resources Germany could never replace. America, by contrast, had absorbed the blow and responded with crushing force. He thought again of the trucks, the endless trucks that carried American divisions where German soldiers had to march. He thought of the radios, the fuel cans, the spare parts, all produced in such abundance that no American soldier ever lacked them. He thought of the letters American soldiers received weekly from home, letters carried across the ocean on ships and planes that Germany could never hope to stop. This was not just a war of bullets, it was a war of supply, and America had mastered it. By 1945, the evidence of collapse was everywhere. Germany's armies were retreating on every front. In the east, the Red Army surged forward with overwhelming force, supplied in part by American trucks and weapons delivered through Lend-Lease. In the west, Allied armies pushed across France, Belgium, and into the Reich itself, supported by skies filled with American aircraft. The colonel walked through villages turned to dust, saw columns of refugees fleeing bombed-out cities, and wondered how long his country could endure. He knew the answer. Not long. America's factories had already decided the outcome, and every day, every convoy, every plane only hastened the inevitable. The colonel thought often of how it must look from the other side. He imagined Detroit, its skyline filled with smokestacks belching clouds of steam and smoke. He imagined shipyards in California, where keels were laid down in the morning and ships floated by nightfall. He imagined the endless assembly lines, where workers, men and women, young and old, labored with a confidence born of distance, safety, and abundance. For them, the war was something to be supplied, not endured. Their children still went to school, their homes still stood untouched, their nights were not shattered by bombs. It was a war fought with tools, with machines, with unbreakable faith in production. Against that, the colonel knew, no army in Europe could stand. When Berlin finally fell in April 1945, the colonel was not surprised. The city had endured weeks of bombardment, its streets reduced to rubble, its civilians huddled in cellars, its soldiers exhausted. The Red Army surged into the capital, fighting street by street, building by building. Yet even in those final days, the colonel's thoughts drifted westward, to America, to the factories that had made this ending possible. The Reich had been defeated by many enemies, the Soviets, the British, the resistance fighters across occupied Europe. But above all, it had been defeated by a nation that had turned its industrial might into a weapon beyond imagining. America's factories had drowned Germany in steel and fire. And so, as the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the colonel reflected on the lesson that history would remember. Germany had sought to master Europe through speed, precision, and ferocity, but it had underestimated the true nature of modern war. It was not brilliance alone that decided victory. It was not the sharpness of a single blade, but the weight of countless hammers. America had understood this, and in its understanding, it had forged an arsenal so vast, so inexhaustible, that no enemy could resist it. The colonel, who had once believed in German destiny, now believed in something else, that the future would belong to those who could build not the finest weapon but the greatest number of them. He closed his eyes and imagined the roar of those factories, the endless thrum of engines, the pounding of hammers, the rhythm of assembly lines. He imagined the workers who had never seen the front, yet whose labor had shaped its outcome. He imagined the ships sliding into the sea, the planes lifting into the sky, the tanks rumbling onto trains. And he knew, with the clarity of one who has lived through catastrophe, that it was not generals or strategies or even courage that had decided the war. It was the factories of America and the men and women who had filled them with life.